Turnmill Street didn't produce any celebrities. It was the whole area that developed a name for itself. Starting from the time of the Tudors, the street became known as a haunt of suspected persons. That is, people suspected of a range of disorderly behaviour, from wandering around without an occupation to gambling, drunkenness and keeping brothels. This reputation grew up before newspapers existed. We hear of the loose women and general immorality of Turnmill Street in ballads, pamphlets and plays of the time. Any facts we have are mostly from official orders and proclamations, and from the documents that survive from court cases. Dr. Gillian Spraggs has used these documents to make a study of Turnmill Street and build up a picture of some of the individuals who lived there.
In the early 17th century, Clerkenwell was a village on the northern edge of London. It was under the control of the Middlesex Justices of the Peace. The City of London was closely controlled by the Mayor and Aldermen, but their authority stopped at Smithfield Market. Middlesex was much less well regulated. As a result, Clerkenwell developed a certain kind of reputation. It was known for its drinking dens, which were often also brothels, for its street toughs, who swaggered around picking fights, and for its pickpockets and its whores. Clerkenwell was also the place where the Middlesex Justices held their sessions. Until 1613 they met in a local inn, but after that they met in a purpose-built courthouse called Hick's Hall. Only relatively minor cases were heard there. Important cases, like robbery and murder, were held at the Old Bailey in the city. Many of the Middlesex legal records have survived. They're held at London Metropolitan Archives. In the case of the more disorderly residents of Clerkenwell, it's often possible to find out quite a bit about them, and particularly about their illegal activities. In 1611, a woman called Joan Carrow, or Carr, was summoned into court to answer charges of keeping a brothel. We know about this because a recognisance was taken from Joan Carrow and two sureties to make sure that she turned up in court. Recognisances are rather dull documents in Latin, but quite often they have interesting bits of English notes on them as well. Incidentally, one of her two sureties was a man called Garrett Day. He was quite closely associated with Joan Carrow in a couple of other cases. Joan Carrow's house was on Turnmill Street, one of the most notorious streets in London. Shakespeare mentions it in Henry IV Part 2, when Falstaff mocks the foolish Justice Shallow for boasting about the feats he hath done about Turnmill Street during his wild youth. In January 1612, Joan Carrow was again suspected of running a brothel, a notorious bawdy house, as the note on the recognisance has it. A woman called Anne Gilson had been arrested at her house for being alone in a room with a man at 10 o'clock at night. A recognisance was taken from Anne Gilson as well. She claimed that she had come to buy a waistcoat. This suggests that one of the sidelines of Joan Carrow's business was buying and selling old clothes, which would have been a useful cover for people coming and going from her house at odd hours. Joan Carrow had a number of aliases: Carr, Calcol, Calcut and Cole. As Joan Cole, she was one of a number of Clerkenwell women who were arrested for brothel keeping and taken to Bridewell Prison in April 1612. The justices seem to have intended to keep them there until the next sessions was held, but Joan Cole's friend Garrett Day stepped in and bailed the lot of them. The justices were not very pleased about this, and they called Garrett Day into court to answer for this and other activities that had annoyed them. One of the things they also complained about was that he had obtained a licence for Joan Cole under an assumed name. This would have been a licence for keeping an alehouse. Alehouse licences were supposed to be given to law-abiding people, not to brothel madams. She didn't keep her alehouse licence for long. In August 1612, she was one of a number of Clerkenwell alehouse keepers who got into trouble for selling their customers short measure. She sold them less ale than they'd paid for, basically. For this she was fined 20 shillings, which was quite a lot of money. It also seems likely that her licence was taken away. Certainly, a few months later, she was in trouble for selling ale without a licence. So far, Joan Cole had got off fairly lightly. But in December 1613, things started to turn a bit nasty. Once again, she was called into court on suspicion of keeping a brothel, On this occasion the justices had prepared a case against her, and there is an indictment, a document mainly in Latin, which gives details of the charges and tells us about some of the circumstances. It also has some abbreviations in Latin that tell us what happened in court. They tell us that she pleaded not guilty, but nonetheless she was convicted. And it has quite a detailed note in English, which tells us about the penalty. The penalty for brothel keeping was brutal. She was sentenced to be tied to the back of a cart, taken from the jail to the house where she lived, and flogged all the way, with a bell ringing in front to attract people's attention and make sure they all came out to see her in her shame. After this, she was taken back to the jail, and she was to be kept there until she could find sureties who would guarantee that she would leave the neighbourhood and be of good behaviour thereafter. At this point, she left Clerkenwell, no doubt very wisely, and lived in Norton Folgate under yet another alias. Norton Folgate was a little enclave between Bishopsgate and Shoreditch, and again, it was an area that wasn't under the control of the city authorities, so policing was relatively relaxed. Nonetheless, the law caught up with Joan Carr, or Carrow, or Cole, or Calcott, or, as she now called herself, Price, once again. In the summer of 1616, she got into trouble for helping two burglars who had stolen a large amount of expensive women's clothing. It's very likely that she was their fence, because of course there are indications that dealing in second-hand clothes was one of her enterprises, so it's very likely that she bought this stuff off them, intending to sell it on. Burglary was a capital offence. The two burglars were sentenced to be hanged. Joan pleaded not guilty, but she was convicted. And a stylised S, written on the indictment, tells us what happened to her. It stands for suspendator, which is Latin for let her be hanged.